The Kyoto Prize was founded by Kazuo Inamori in Japan as a prize that would celebrate some of the best achievements in science, in the arts and philosophy, and in technology. It's about 100 million yen, that's nearly $1 million, and it's awarded in Kyoto each year. Kazuo Inamori founded this prize because of his own deep sense that we need to celebrate human achievement that feeds the human spirit. And that's what the prize does each year. It brings together excellence in all of these domains. The Kyoto Prize laureates have included people like Jane Goodall, known to most people for her work on chimpanzees and primates, Akira Kurosawa, the incredible Japanese filmmaker, or Martha Nussbaum, the extraordinary American political philosopher. Here at the Blavatnik School of Government, we partner with the Kyoto Prize to celebrate it, to bring the Kyoto Prize winners here to the heart of Oxford University, because they enable us not just to hear about the cutting edge of technology, of science, of art and philosophy, but to invite all our colleagues from other parts of Oxford, from Oxford's high schools, from other universities. The Blavatnik School of Government is a department of Oxford University with a mission to improve government around the world. It's to help people learn how to serve, to lead, to govern with a clear sense of who they're serving and why.
For too long, universities have hidden behind an ivory tower, and the commitment of the Blavatnik School is to open up the work of the university to the world around it.
Oxford University is full of brilliant researchers, teachers, students, working on some of the world's biggest challenges. What we love to do at the Blavatnik School is to bring them together with some of the leaders who are making the actual decisions and help be a portal through which all that brilliant research can actually be used and have impact. Every year here at the Blavatnik School, we're delighted to host the Kyoto Prize lectures. I was so excited to see the latest Kyoto Prize laureates.
Bob Rader's approach to dismantling cells was revolutionary. Dissecting transcription in vitro has led us to the massive insights that we have into this process today.
What is modern science? What social systems are in play when you're creating science? These questions weren't really being asked before Latour.
Professor Yao's work gave us new ways of understanding algorithms. Yao's minimax principle gives us a way of bounding the hardness of certain kinds of algorithms.
Both Oxford scholars and the Kyoto laureates are animated by a thirst for knowledge, an energy and a commitment always to improve, never to be satisfied. And that's what makes excellence. The University of Oxford is a deeply international institution. We have partnerships across the world. We always have. We accepted our first international student in the year 1169, and we have been welcoming students ever since. The mission of the Kyoto Prize is the very same mission that animated the founders of this university almost 900 years ago. A commitment to excellence, a commitment to using that excellence for the betterment of society.
These values of humility and service, but also of outstanding excellence, are exactly the values that we hope to reinforce in every student that walks through the door.
Welcome, in person and virtually, to the 5th Kyoto Prize at Oxford. I'm Callum Miller, Chief Operating Officer and Associate Dean here at the Blavatnik School, and it's my great pleasure to see, in particular, so many of you here with us in Oxford today. After having to postpone the Kyoto Prize in Oxford in 2020 and celebrating in a virtual format last year, I know my colleagues here at the school and our partners in the Inamori Foundation share my excitement at the return of in-person events to celebrate the academic achievements of the scholars based on deep values, values that turn individual excellence into wider benefit for humanity. Though our colleagues at the Inamori Foundation are unfortunately unable to join us here in person, we're honoured to welcome them virtually to this lecture and trust that they will convey on all of our behalf greetings to Dr. Inamori and their colleagues in Japan. So it gives me great pleasure to open officially this lecture by Dr. Bruno Latour, the 2021 Kyoto Prize Laureate in Arts and Philosophy. Professor Latour will join us remotely today from France. Those who joined the Laureate's panel last night and those who know his work will already know that Professor Latour is a disciplinary hopper. He's someone who traverses different labels as he applies his intellect to problems and questions that pique his interest, regardless of where that disciplinary area may land. So it's only fitting that I am delighted to welcome two colleagues here from Oxford who themselves defy some disciplinary definition and are committed to interdisciplinary research. Professor Erica Charters is Professor of Global History of Medicine at the University of Oxford in the History Faculty. Her research examines disease, state power, warfare, and how these intersect in the 18th century, especially in colonial contexts. More broadly, Professor Charters is interested in the relationship between war and civil society during the early modern period. In the context of COVID-19, she's coordinating a multidisciplinary project on how epidemics end. Javier Lezaun is a James Martin Lecturer in Science and Technology Governance. He's the lead researcher at the Institute for Science, Innovation and Society in the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography, and he's a Fellow of Kellogg College. Dr. Lezaun's research focuses on the governance of new biotechnologies and the impact of organizational models in pharmaceutical R&D. I'm delighted that they're here to lead you through the lecture. I'm going to hand over to Professor Charters to introduce the lecture by Dr. Latour, and then Dr. Lezaun will lead the Q&A thereafter. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Erica Charters, and as Director of Oxford Centre for the History of Science, Medicine and Technology, and alongside Javier Lezaun, who's Director of Oxford's Institute for Science, Innovation and Society, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Bruno Latour and his lecture for the 2021 Kyoto Prize. I think it's very difficult to think of an author who has had a deeper or a broader influence in the sciences and in the humanities than Bruno Latour. When I mentioned to some of my students that Bruno Latour would be delivering a lecture in Oxford this year, one of them blurted out, "Wait, Latour is a real person?" This surprise that this towering intellect, which is scattered throughout our reading lists and in our footnotes, and whose name has become an adjective, is indeed a flesh and blood person, I think captures the depth of his intellectual influence. I'll only mention in passing some of his seminal works: Laboratory Life, The Pasteurization of France, We Have Never Been Modern, The Making of Law, Reassembling the Social, Facing Gaia, and so many more, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But Bruno Latour's influence goes beyond the impact of particular pieces of scholarship, of particular concepts, and of theories. What makes his work so significant and what makes the Kyoto Prize of such relevance is that he is one of the few thinkers who has established new terms of debate among the sciences, including the natural sciences and the humanities. This does not mean, of course, that his arguments are universally accepted. To the contrary, he has been an intensely controversial figure, but of course in the best sense of that word. But Bruno Latour's scholarship has created new ways of looking at the world and new ways that allow different forms of knowledge to engage with one another. In some ways, he has created the conditions for a parliament of disciplines, a deliberative engagement with the world that manages to transcend the epistemologies of individual disciplines. Moreover, Bruno Latour accomplishes this not through dry theoretical posturings. Instead, he's a pleasure to read, an intellectual page-turner. Throughout his scholarship, we are faced with an insistent interlocutor. It may start off as a gentle conversation, but soon we, the reader, are being questioned, we're being puzzled, we're being pushed, perhaps we're even being hectored by an insistent voice that asks us to think again, think more precisely, and to think also more broadly. Before we know it, we are deep in a conversation with a frustrating and yet also charming interrogator. Bruno Latour's work on the new climactic regime and his reflections on the new cosmology exemplify the generative power of his thinking. Please now I present Bruno Latour and his Kyoto Prize lecture, How to React to a Change in Cosmology.
It's very moving to have to receive the Kyoto Prize here, because this is the place where for 4 generations the Latour's family has lived and got its luck, so to speak, because of a plight. The phylloxera destroyed entirely everything else here, the whole wine region of Burgundy, and it was then replanted and replenished much later, especially in this neighborhood in Corton by my great-great-grandfather. The other reason, of course, is that wine is entirely about fermentation and microbes and bacillus and all of those ferments. And it's, of course, something which we are now very much reminded of because of the COVID epidemic. So I will use the COVID as a sort of lead because of the type of entity that the viruses has taught us, a very harsh teaching, of course, during those 2 last year. We learn from, collectively, of course, if you are a specialist of viruses, you didn't learn anything, but we, the whole earthly community, so to speak, relearn something about viruses, the virality, so to speak, of that type of agent. Virality, the way it spread, is extremely typical of viruses and microbes. First, we learn, which is quite extraordinary, that from basically January a year and a half ago and 3 weeks later, the virus going from mouth to mouth, from mouth to end, from one person to another person, starting probably somewhere in China, spread everywhere and became completely globalized. And that sort of connectedness, the sort of very fast and speed is typical of virality. So is the surprising speed at which it mutates. And we learn, again, somewhat tragically, how fast the viruses is actually learning other habits, so to speak, through this multiplication of variants, which we now follow in the press every day, which, again, we were very surprised by. And the other thing which I've studied for years is, of course, that it completely modified our social relation. We had to wear masks, we had to distance ourselves. And those social relations were not only modified among the families inside the small circle, not only nationally, inside any given nation, Japan or France, but it was also an amazing experience of relearning connection between countries. I mean, as we know, we cannot go from one country to the next, and we learn every day that this country is available, but not that country, etc. So the whole connectedness of human relation was modified by the insertion of the virus's own way of connecting and connecting people globally. So it has a different view of the global, its own way of globalizing. It has a different view of mutating, and it has a different view of modifying every other entity, including human, bacteria, of course, inside which it inserts itself. And that's very interesting, and of course for me especially, because I've studied Louis Pasteur, the great French bacteriologist, for many years ago. And of course, it's what I've studied in Pasteur's case, that is how microbes inserted into society in the 19th century deeply modified what we could call the social order at the time. And we relearned that with the AIDS, of course, tragic story. We're still learning it, and with every epidemic. But we relearn it globally with the COVID, and that's what interests me. So I want to use a virality with as a guide, as a sort of a token, could say a mascot, because every cosmology has its own privileged object, if I can say that. And I want to contrast what was the privileged object before and what is now the privileged object, which I will argue is something like the virus, a type of virality, or actually in English also vitality, which is so typical of a sort of situation in which we are now embedded. So I want to argue about a shift in cosmology, and I use cosmology as anthropologists would do, as a sort of the structures that distribute agencies around. So I want to start with the very strange puzzle. Why were we surprised by the emergence of a virus? I mean, this is absolutely normal ways in which they spread. Microbes have done that forever. We know that when we do fermentation in the wine business right here, and we were nonetheless completely surprised to have to change the whole fabric of our society because of the emergence of viruses. So that's what I want to understand. Why were we puzzled by a type of entity which is so absolutely typical of the way the world in which we live and have ever lived is being built? So I want to contrast with an older privileged object of the cosmology earlier. And we could say that if we were looking for a typical object, we would probably, at least in the Western imagination, use Galileo's inclined plane, where the rolling balls go down in order to calculate the laws of falling bodies. I mean, there is one canonic example, an icon of what we imagine the world to function in the past cosmology, that would be it. You have a plane, you have bio balls, they can run, and that's what allows to connect. Now, the problem with this privileged object is that it has two very strange consequences. The first consequence is that it works only in ideal condition. Because of course, when Galileo did the experiment, as every historian of science knows, it was not exactly as accurate as he said, because you had to forget all of the consequences, all of the resistance of the air, and so on. So the law, which was, of course, discovered by Galileo and then, of course, by the whole Newtonian mechanics, etc., works, but only in ideal conditions. So you have to shift away, so to speak, from the ways in which we living bodies live in order to say that this law is actually fully and completely calculable. Which is not a problem. I mean, every science has to idealize its subject. But it has one second consequence, which is slightly more worrying, is that the scientists themselves, so to speak, imagine that they are themselves transported somewhere in the out-of-space, abstract, calculable model. So they confuse the invention they have of a world, of the ideal world, with they themselves being somewhere idealized and in another world, which is well known now in the science critique by the word view from nowhere. So the science has been sort of shifted away, and the scientists have been shifted away from the practical consequences of their own living, so to speak, existence. And that's a very unfortunate consequence, because it means that when we talk about those privileged objects, that is, falling bodies, and the science that knows about them in a sort of view from nowhere, they are themselves nowhere. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we were so surprised by the emergence of the viruses. And of course, we know that the origin of this view from nowhere, at least in Western tradition, is actually a consequence of a theology, the Christian theology of a God, which is an all-powerful God, which is itself, himself, or herself, nowhere. So the I could say that, the nowhereness of a science imagination, what is called the scientific view of the world, is in Western tradition a descendant of the theology and of Christian theology. So, if we take this privileged object of the first cosmology, I think that explains in part why we were so surprised by the emergence of the sort of globalized virus. Because if you have as your canonic example of what the world is made of, the floating bodies, which I take as the canonical mascot, so to speak, of the earlier cosmology, life forms are very strange. Life forms have nowhere to go. They have to be pigeonholed, so to speak, in the view from nowhere, but they're completely different. Their grammar, so to speak, of agency, the way they behave, is entirely different. And as you know, biology had always great difficulty in entering, in sort of being pigeonholed into the tradition coming from mechanics, physics, and so on, all the way from the beginning of the 17th century to the mid-20th century. Why? Because life forms, and again, the COVID is a very good example of that, they react very fast, so they're constantly sort of agitated by other sort of behavior. They mutate, as I said, we observe that all the time with the different variants. They adapt very quickly, they converge sometimes, they overlap with one another, and they have connection with one another. Viruses, we don't even know if viruses are our enemies or our friends. So we cannot even locate them. Sometimes we need viruses, and if we had no viruses and no bacteria, we would not survive. And sometimes we have to fight them or find a solution to accommodate their very quick ways of mutating. So we have a completely strange relation, strange by comparison with the other canonical model which was used in the former cosmology, but completely normal in this world in which we live. So this is a great, I think, a great source of a surprise, and the reason why the COVID epidemiology was so completely surprised. The grammar of agency is completely different if you take now the viruses as the typical object of what resemble to be a new cosmology. And of course, Darwin was supposed to make a big difference to it. But in fact, even in Darwin, the organisms are supposed to be obeying an order of nature, which is the laws of nature being natural selection, which plays about the same role as the laws of floating bodies in the canonical tradition. So Darwin did not modify deeply this sort of a situation. There was still an order of nature. And what we observe today is that there's no order of nature. There are viruses upon bacteria, upon organisms, etc., which are constantly moving in this and building this world of ours. So what I could now conclude from that is that today we are shifting from one privileged object, which I described as a floating bodies example, to another one, which I would say is this my strange idea of taking virality as the best example. But if we do it, we have to land somewhere. We have to actually situate ourselves inside a world of organism for which the virus and the grammar of agency that it represents is absolutely typical of a situation. Of course, it was there before. I mean, there is virology, bacteriology, all sorts of science of those entities before. But they were at the margin of the privileged object of the first cosmology. And now we are moving to another cosmology where the privileged object is this. And what is really interesting, and I want to do my second part of my little argument with this, is that it has enormous consequences. It has a big consequence for what I've called in a recent book the new climatic regime. The new climatic regime is the situation inside we find now ourselves. First, if you take the viruses and virality as the privileged object of the new cosmology, science is no longer a view from nowhere. Science is inserted inside the life of organism, as we saw magnificently during the COVID lockdown. I mean, we learned a lot about epidemiology. We learned a lot about the difficulty of knowing what the virus was doing. All of the sciences which was mobilized during this period was highly visible, made explicitly visible, disputed in the popular press as well as in the scientific press. So there was no way we could actually do for the science of the viruses what had been done before for the science of mechanics, with the scientists going away and imagining that they had a view from nowhere. No, they had a view from here, and they were very much inserted into all the controversies about the viruses and how it was actually followed, and in the magnificent case of a vaccine, how quickly it was possible to actually control some of its activity, only some of its activities, because you know all the imbroglio and all the difficulty to pursue the vaccination in every country. The second, of course, big consequence of this shift in cosmology is that we begin to learn, to our great dismay, at least in Western tradition and Western society, about the constant activity and the quick reactivity of all these living entities. And the most amazing thing is that this is true at the very small scale of a virus and at the extremely big scale of the atmosphere. Because after all, the whole geopolitics now is around this question of climate control and the complexity of making the climate the result of the activity not only of the life forms in the past, but of human life forms in the present. So at the two extremes, at the viruses and at the atmospheric level, we learn that at an extraordinary speed, living forms react to our action, and we are reacting to their action. We got sick from the viruses, and the atmosphere gets sick, so to speak, from our own activity in the last 100 years. So it changed the default position, if you want. Before these things were known, but they were peripheral, they were marginal. Now they are absolutely necessary. They are the default position where to compare, so to speak, with every single movement and agency. And the third consequence, and I will conclude on that, is that, of course, the canonical object, the preferred mascot of the earlier cosmology, was, triggered a different project for the evolution and the drive, the vectors of history. History was supposed to be a movement to try, as far as you could, to escape from the earth and lived in this imagined world of a scientific vision of the world as it had been imagined by first cosmology, taking the Galilean laws of body as its privileged object, so to speak. I simplify, of course, I dramatize, but it's to make point much clearer. But now, if you take virality, viruses, the way they spread, the way they react to action, and if you take it at the two levels, the extremely small and the extremely big, and all of the intermediary, you are in a different project. You enter into very much a different history. And that's the complete shift from what I've called in several books and a longer career, the end of a modernist project, if you will. Modernism in the Western tradition was completely driven by this vector, completely driven by this idea that we could actually shift out of the world in some sort of strange way, with a sort of strange imagination that there was a world of infinite access and infinite resources. Now, we are back to Earth. Now there is no way you can actually move out of the Earth. You have to get back into it. And this is what I've been arguing for many years. But I have to say that the COVID epidemic was so prodigiously instructive for all of us because of a connection with the climate crisis itself. So it's two crises sort of lodged into one another, one for the medical, so to speak, and one for the cosmological. Well, that's exactly why we now have to work on the new project, which is something probably fairly different from the modernist project: science, the art, and the law, and all of the moral sciences. So I'm very proud of receiving the prize, and I thank you again very much for receiving the prize, because that's the sort of thing I'd like to push in the rest of my career. What is the alternative to the modernist project if we have to live here and not there? I mean, I know there are people who want to go to Mars, but it's a sort of project of the past. The project of the future is actually to get back in here. And it's fairly amusing for me to say that here, in my own house, so to speak, and in the deeply microbe-built, how could I have it? If there's one thing which is microbe-built, it's actually the wine. So maybe at the end of this little talk, we'll celebrate in some ways, and I will try to find a way to celebrate the Kyoto Prize. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. I believe Professor Latour is going to join us for a discussion.
I'm here.
Bruno, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for an incredibly stimulating lecture. I was going to describe it as uplifting, but then I realized that was not the right term to describe the movement down to earth that you advocated for. We have time for questions, but before we open it up for a discussion, I was wondering if you wanted to add any additional live remarks today.
Yes, if I can say thank you, Javier, and thank you for the very nice introduction and very generous. I, of course, wanted to talk to you, and I was worried about the transmission. So this is why I used the film that the Anya Mori Foundation made. But it was a year ago, and of course there has been several things since. The reason why I'm interested in this hypothesis about the change in cosmology, it's a hypothesis, I'm not sure I'm right, is because I get, like many climate people, climate activists, desperate about the reason why we don't act so quickly about the threat which we all know about. So everybody in very different fields are trying to understand this. And this is my little proposition that we are in a different cosmology. And the reason why it's so slow to come to us is one of the reasons why we are so slow to react to the type of beings, what I call in this lecture the grammar of agency. And I was very reminded of that by the speed at which we mobilized the whole Europe and America when the war in Ukraine started. Obviously, when a war in the sense of occupying a territory is being waged, we sort of know how to react very quickly. And we did react very quickly. There is an incredibly amount of passion and decisions which have been made in a few weeks. And when you look at the other war, the war which is also a war of occupying the territories of others, but through other means, through CO2 emission, through biodiversity, for extraction and so on, we are extraordinarily slow. So the contrast between these two mobilizing ethos, so to speak, reminded me of the distance between the way we react and the world we live in. So that's the idea. And I was even more interested in the fact that immediately when the war started, the dependence of Europe, at least, on gas and oil from Russia became central, and it associated the strong type of reaction we have when a war is being waged and the slow reaction we have when we have to tackle decision about climate catastrophe. And in that case, at least, I don't know how it's going to be worked out. In this case, at least, there was a connection between the two. And suddenly people realized that something has to be done for gas and oil, which was a source of maybe we would accept sacrifice we would never have accepted for ecological reason. So the whole idea is to dramatize, and I agree with my little argument here is a dramatization, in order to decide, so to speak, the world we live in. It's very odd. But after all, this is what all historians know. We changed cosmology once already in the Western world when in the 16th century and 17th century, we shifted from the cosmologically, the sort of cosmos, medieval cosmos to the new Newtonian cosmos. So we already had this experience, and it's documented and it's studied by many historians. It had big influence in literature, in the art, etc. So I'm trying to think about it around this parallel, so to speak, between a change in cosmology, which has been experienced and is so influential in the way we teach students and we learn about history, and the one in which we are, which it goes both ways. It allows us to understand better what was the traumatic experience that they had to live through in the 17th century, and maybe bring some of the tools which had been invented in the 16th and 17th century to handle this enormous change in cosmology today, especially in the arts, in literature, in law, and in all this field. This is what maybe should be added to it. There's just one little point, if I can, Javier, to add, which is not completely clear, as I heard the lecture, is that when I compare the small viruses and the large, it's of course because of a hypothesis of Gaia, that is that the atmosphere itself, as maybe not everybody is aware of that argument, is controlled and has been controlled in billions of years in the past by the activity of living forms, especially bacteria and viruses. So it's not just a joke that the small and the big, the smallest and the biggest are actually the same question, because both of them are made and have been created, engineered by the life forms over the eons of time. And maybe this is not so clear in the argument. So maybe this was just a few things I wanted to add.
Thank you, Bruno, for those additional remarks. So we have a bit of time for questions, both from people physically in the room and also those joining us via Zoom today. So I will encourage people attending the lecture via Zoom to type their questions in the questions and answer function, and I will try to read out at least some of those coming through online. But maybe we can start with somebody who is physically present in the room and wants to make a first question. Please.
Thanks so much for the lecture. I'm quite taken by how you're describing a we as entering a new cosmology. And I was wondering who the we is in your argument.
Well, as the lecture says, I use, I think, 4 times the word Western imagination and Western history. It's completely connected to only the Western history, because the change in cosmology, as there are first many different cosmologies in addition, but it's an experience which is only linked to the, let's say, those who have been associated with the modernist product. Now, what is really interesting is that, of course, the new cosmology, if it exists, if it has a sense in the way it will be used by critical zone scientists, artists, etc., does connect slightly better with other tradition, which had been sort of pushed at the margin during the modernist period as archaic, and who suddenly becomes more central to the definition. I was discussing yesterday with Greek specialists, and they say that my Gaia and their physis, we are studying the notion of physis in botany in the Greek tradition, resembles a lot of the things that we are working around the notion of critical zone. So it always, in this question of cosmology, has to be very closely delineated and connected only to a drama, tragedy, which has been the Western one, and which had been unfortunately imposed during colonization and the empire to the others. But of course, cosmology is in the plural. There are many more than 2. That's for sure.
So I'm going to start with this one. This comes from Tim House. Thank you, Professor Latour. You mentioned that religion might be in part responsible for the planetary crisis we face by encouraging some to go, quote unquote, away from the Earth. But conversely, can resources be found in religion, for example, in the Catholic tradition, for encouraging believers and society more widely to come back down to Earth and be responsible citizens in the context of the new climatic regime? Can religion, in other words, be an ally in this regard? Thank you.
Well, hello, Tim. I'm sorry I cannot go to have a drink at your house. And this is beginning to be frustrating because it's the 3rd time that drinks are offered in those Zoom lectures, and I cannot go to drink with you. Even
we will find a way.
I mentioned mine. I've been very interested, as you are, in the possibility that the Christian tradition would offer. But at the 17th century connection with the science imagination was produced, the model for a view from nowhere was indeed captured and extracted and probably betrayed from somewhat rationalized Christian theology. And theology has been rationalized, if that might be a strange way of putting it, ever since. But now, as the Pope Francois showed in his encyclical, there is a shift everywhere now that Christians are trying to reimagining their own theology in sort of correspondence or resonance with the new climatic regime. And of course, there are good, there are many good elements in this tradition, including the fathers of the church and the whole Orthodox tradition and many others, where just to take one example, the notion of incarnation, which after all is a central dogma of the whole church and churches, can be rephrased. But it needs a lot of work, because still a lot of the metaphors, a lot of the ways we imagine is look up when we talk about religion. And it's very difficult to rephrase and replay and reinvent hymns and poems, rituals to say, look, when we talk about religion, we look here. It takes time, and I'm very interested in pursuing this task with some Catholics in Germany and in France, and maybe I hope with you.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions here up front. Well, now we have more than a couple, but let's start with Jerry.
Yes. Yes, my question is along the same lines as the previous one. It would be to ask you, do you believe that consciousness is more expanded through matter than the Galilean billiard ball cosmology has assumed? Is there more consciousness out there, which many Gaia adherents believe in? Or do you think that the Gaia is only a convenient analogy and does not actually imply that there is an expanded consciousness out in the world?
That's a difficult question, because I've worked for 15 years on Gaia and I'm still not sure how to present it. I've tried really everything to try to face Gaia, and always avoiding the notion of consciousness, which associate Gaia with sort of too closely anthropocentric version. But then Gaia is such a strange animal that it's very difficult to answer your question so quickly. But I take Gaia very seriously as a real being, not just as a metaphor. And I take it as a way, a good, convenient, efficient, important way, and politically relevant way of contrasting with nature. Because the great advantage of Gaia that it's local. I mean, it's limited to what I also call critical zone. I did a big book at MIT Press with lots of scientists and friends on critical zone, because it's another terms which doesn't trigger the same passion as Gaia does. And so I would avoid consciousness, but not the word Gaia. I think it's a very important concept. And I think it's extremely important to try to activate it. I tried everything, play, talks, papers, and I failed. Gaia is always associated with something which is too strange for usual consumption. So maybe one day I will arrive to the notion of consciousness, but not quite now. It's a very important question for me, what you ask.
Thank you very much for your lecture. There were two terms that fascinated me especially. First is the privileged object of a cosmology, and the second, the grammar of agency. And now I wondered about when you talked about a new privileged object, or the privileged object of our new cosmology, that it has a different grammar of agency. Now, how would you delimit this concept beyond the virus as an object in itself, and as a structuring concept of the cosmology in a sense that goes beyond the object, because of course cosmology does not only have an object, but a privileged object, but many more things. So how far would you say that the concept of this grammar of agency is distributed in our cosmology beyond just the virus?
Well, of course, I use the virus for pedagogical reason, and also because we had lived 3 terrible years having to confront it. But the real argument philosophically has been made, of course, by Alfred North Whitehead, by making the contrast in a very clear sense, which is that in the earlier cosmology, objects can be actually distinct from one another, partes, extra partes, which is impossible with living forms. I mean, living form is even more general in the case of Whitehead, because they overlap. I mean, they are superimposed. So it's as simple as that. The divide between the two cosmology, what Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature in the 17th, 18th century, was around this. And it's always the conundrum, are things able to sit side by side, or are they overlapping and superimposed? Now, in the new cosmology, we learn, to our dismay and great enthusiasm, if you are a biologist, you're an ecologist, you're an ethologist, that the objects are superimposed. And there's no way they don't overlap. And this overlapping is very difficult to make understood in the Western tradition of law, the Western tradition of fiction, even, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. One more question on the third row.
Thank you so much. Also really lucky to be able to get to ask a question. Thank you for your lecture. I wanted to ask, because you grounded the explanation of the new cosmology in the example set by the COVID-19 pandemic, and how I found at least that the COVID-19 pandemic placed us in two ways, just both in a very specific place in which we were usually stuck and couldn't go out, but also we suddenly become aware of all of these supply chains, both of information passing and of material passing that were creaking at the seams when they started to collapse and fail. I guess this new cosmology, we live in such an interconnected world. Previously, in the 16th and 17th century, cosmology arose in a very specific locus in Western Europe, in a set of countries, and there was a lot of intellectual exchange within a relatively limited space with limited supply chains. As you say, there are many other cosmologies that exist, and the interconnection of the world is so vast that basically problems such as climate change and the pandemic have to be addressed on a global level. And so it's difficult, I guess, to return down to earth when all of the kind of global supply chains, both intellectual and material, are so dispersed and lead us to a sort of upward thinking mentality. And you've placed yourself very firmly in Burgundy. How do you think that we can transition to a much more place-based interpretation of the cosmology that has to incorporate so many globalized actors? I don't know if that...
I placed myself in Burgundy, but right now I'm in Paris. And the local is actually never local. So down to earth means two things completely, which apparently are different, but they are different in the modernist imagination, not in the new cosmology precisely. I mean, what's the virus? Is the virus local or is it global? Well, it does globalize point to point very quickly, and it creates a chain of connectedness as if it was a sort of model for actor network theory, so to speak. And the local, certainly there is in the notion of the down to earth, back to the local, but then the realization, as you perfectly said yourself, that the local is never such. And when you begin to do a sort of the work of description of your own territory, if you were doing it, you would immediately spread everywhere. And it's this everywhereness which is the interesting features. It's different from the idea which has been associated with the local imagination, with the modernist imagination that Anna Tsing called scaling up. And there's a big difference between scaling up, that is everything we have to shift from the local to the global immediately, and what is the new connection between the local and the global associated with living forms. And again, the COVID, I think, is a perfect example. But so will be the atmosphere. The CO2 is another globalizing element which goes everywhere because of its nature as a gas. And it's everywhere there. But it's not the same for water. And the water of rivers don't have the same globalizing effect. So every single entity has a different ways of connecting global and local. And that's one of the great lessons of a shift from one cosmology to the next. I didn't say that getting out of a modernist project would be easy.
Thank you. I'm going to move back to the Zoom conversation, and I apologize because there's no time to relay all the questions in the chat, but I'm going to read the most recent one from Rebecca Critch. Thank you, Professor Latour. How does anthropocentrism and biocentrism relate to or fit into this new cosmology?
Sorry,
I can repeat the question.
I'm just trying to understand what my answer would be. Anthropocentrism and biocentrism are typically modernist concepts. So the anthropos, distinguished from its own life and all its own viruses and bacteria and organs and so on, I think it's precisely the sort of thing that are being not exactly outdated, but shifted away by the interest in the earth, or to use the word which is difficult to pronounce because it's so badly understood, Gaia explores. So I would not build a big argument about the difference between biocentrism and anthropocentrism. I think the anthropos is so decentered right now, but so is the bios as well. I mean, we are both actually victims of the end of modernism and of a climate catastrophe. So that would be my quick answer.
Great. So let me maybe rephrase this, not the same question, but maybe the same line of questioning, because in the new cosmology that you presented, we can draw a lot of lessons from the viral grammar of agency that the pandemic has revealed. I was wondering what lessons can we draw from the human grammar of agency that the pandemic has also revealed? Many will argue that what we have witnessed is a process of geopolitical fragmentation, increased inequalities, deeper divisions on the role of science and expertise in how we structure our societies. I guess it's a question about the difficulty of the project that will follow the modernist project, but previous idealized objects and previous cosmologies came with very idealized, but also very universalist moral horizons. What sort of moral horizon, if any, can we draw from the experience of how the human actors have reacted to the virus?
We had the unfortunate chance, if I can say that, to have lived simultaneously very quickly through three huge crises, the climate one, the COVID, and then now war. And for every one of them, the definition of what is the agency of the human is being sort of ébranlé, I mean, shattered in incredible ways. So the question of what is a human in the new cosmology is a question to be studied by anthropologists and by activists and by artists, because it's no way clear, as you said very well yourself. The human, but we still maintain the humanist tradition is the human in nature, the human of the cosmology, the first cosmology, with its identity, autonomy, liberty, etc. But if we take one example, which is so striking, is that a human learning to depend on life forms is a human which is very different from the human who was a sort of movement away to expand out of nature and to learn and to cultivate itself by being as far as possible from nature. And it's different also from the old tradition of living with nature. So there's a whole field of work to be done by philosophers, political philosophers, because what is a citizen in this new regime is not clear either. Are we citizens of Gaia? I mean, this is complicated question. What is a citizen when, like today, we read in the papers that it's simultaneously beautiful weather in Paris, and it's 9 degrees warmer than before. What it is to be a citizen in India when it's 50 degrees outside. I mean, it's completely different forms of being a human. It doesn't mean that it's naturalized. On the contrary, it means that it's a new definition, which, after all, the modernists did a whole work for 3 centuries to define the human in the European tradition. And we need to go back to the board and begin to work on what is the human in this new situation, especially one who is dependent. What is the depending human? What is the human that says, my freedom is to depend? We don't know, because lots of people would say, no, I still want to go to Mars. And being a human is to expand and move away and go to colonize the moon and so on. I mean, there's still this drive, which for me is a completely outdated drive, but it's still very important in the mind. But it will actually lead all of us away. Now, what it is to be a human on Earth, I mean, it's still, strangely enough, an original question, because it requires a different definition of a bios and also of a human. So we all have to answer this question. I mean, it's not a question that I will myself have the answer for. I just see the situation of transformation.
Thank you. I think we are out of time, technically, but I might allow one more burning question. There are 2 very close by there. I would choose the man in the blue T-shirt. Oh, both of them have blue T-shirts. No, you.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very invigorating lecture. If I may ask, with the because you seem to hesitate regarding consciousness with Gaia, but let's assume that it's a low-density computational framework, that it talks and there are nodes and so on, and the planet is in a kind of a way alive. Wouldn't that reinvigorate the modernist view of things? Because you could have, shall we say, an external threat, an external object of consideration.
Javier, I'm sorry, but I couldn't really understand the question.
I heard the question, but I don't think I can.
Just to make it simpler. Well. So if Gaia was actually here and alive, in a way, some kind of way, wouldn't that be kind of a reinvigoration of the modernist project? Because you would be encountering essentially a new entity, an external object, something that you can deal with, reason with, think about, where you can apply science on, as opposed to, shall we say, surviving and trying to imagine a subservient position down here on planet Earth.
No, we need all the science we can. And actually, in the work I'm doing on critical zone with geochemists, we are very interested in linking the instruments which allows geochemists to measure everything they can on the 1 kilometer square critical zone. It's a technical word for them because it's a laboratory, a sort of outside laboratory. But then to add all the other entities with which we have to make sensible. So I'm not sure I understood the question, but the computational aspect does not in any way produce necessarily external object outside. This is actually a modernist pretension. I've shown that many times in my work on scientists. Scientists are fully engaged in the object they study. So the more science there is, the less distance there is. It's a definition of science, actually. So the more computational, the better. I mean, it has all sorts of consequences, of course, on how the computation is made, how much energy is devoted to it, and so on. But my argument has nothing to do with a sort of distancing myself from the earth science. It's on the contrary. I mean, we need, this is an entire argument for the earth sciences. And the more earth science, the more we dig into the complexity and multiplicity and difficulty of knowing and understanding all of those reactions that the earth is committed to. I might have completely misunderstood the question.
No, you didn't. Thank you very much.
That's a privilege of an old man.
So sadly, we will have to bring this to a close. Before we go, I once again wanted to thank Professor Latour for a wonderful set of engagements, not only at the lecture, but previously today in a workshop with the students on academic writing, and also yesterday at the colloquium. And also wanted to thank you, of course, the Kyoto Prize for bringing us together today. So please join me in a final round of applause.